This week, Sinan Eren, VP of Zero Trust at Barracuda, will discuss authentication and MFA fatigue. In the security news, while I wait for my teleprompter to get updated, because maybe it had a vulnerability, Bloodhound's blind spots, interactable giraffe, don't use open source, it has too many vulnerabilities. MFA fatigue, tamper protection, use after freedom, how not to do software updates, hacking gamers, stealing Teslas, safer Linux, Trojan putty. There's money in your account. Game leak makes history. GPS jammers. Uber blames lapsus. Spying on your monitor from a Zoom call. Next generation IPS with AI and ML for zero-day exploit detection. 3D printed meat. And what to do when the highway is covered with what's usually kept in the nightstand. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. PlexTrack is the premier pen test reporting and collaboration platform, empowering your team to spend more time hacking and less time reporting. PlexTrack centralizes your data, streamlines tedious workflows, automates report building, and facilitates communication with stakeholders. To learn how you can achieve a 30% increase in efficiency and cut report cycles by up to 65%, head to securityweekly.com/PlexTrack. Claim your free month of PlexTrack and get your copy of the Writing a Killer Penetration Test Report Guide today. Every hack follows the same pattern. First, hackers exploit a human error, like a leaked key or a secret left in code. They gain a foothold and then pivot, moving from one compromised system to the next. Teleport breaks this cycle. Open source Teleport gives every engineer, every piece of hardware, every application an identity, replacing secrets like passwords and keys with auto-expiring identity-based certificates. Learn why most visionary businesses in the world choose Teleport at securityweekly.com/teleport.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man whose son asked him to go to a 50 Cent concert. So he handed him $1 and said, "Take your brother," Mr. Paul Asadoria.
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 756, recorded on September 21st, 2022, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. To my left, Mr. Larry Pache.
It feels like it's been a while.
It has.
We had a week of week vacation, and then I was traveling.
Good to have you back.
I did a what now?
Speaking of not being here in a while, to my far left, Mr. Jeff Mann is here in studio. Jeff, welcome.
It's great to be back.
Yes.
And be the guest bartender for probably the first time in about 2 years.
And be my morning cigar smoking partner.
Yes.
Yeah. We started early.
In afternoon.
In afternoon and
evening.
Now evening, yes.
I gotta say, it's great to have Jeff back in studio and on one of our shows, because making fun of Jeff for being old when he's not here isn't nearly as much fun.
Yeah, I agree.
And he's an amazing human being, so I really
absolutely.
really
and
enjoy it.
in the interim, I actually turned 60.
Like I said,
So
happy
bring it on.
Birthday. Bring it on.
Yeah, we can only make so much fun of Lee for being old.
That's
we
right.
need to spread the love.
Spread the love.
No. There's never an end to making fun of Lee for being old. Okay,
That's also true. Mr. Josh Morpett is here with us. Josh, welcome.
Pleasure. Thank you, sir. Absolute pleasure to be here with Jeff and everybody today.
Looking sharp as always, Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Good to see you guys.
Yes, good to have you.
Everyone in studio. That's nice to see you guys back. Don't be gone so long next time, yeah?
I know, right? Security Weekly listeners can save 20% on InfoSec World 2022 passes. InfoSec World will be held on September 27th through the 29th at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW and use the code ISW22-SecWeek20 to secure your spot now. Not later, like now. But watch this segment first. This segment is sponsored by Barracuda. You can learn more by going to securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Sinan is a veteran in the cybersecurity space and serves as the VP of Zero Trust at Barracuda. Sinan is passionate about helping companies with an increasingly distributed workforce mitigate breach risk by enabling secure access to critical enterprise resources for their outsourcers, partners, contractors, and telework employees. Sinan will join us tonight. He's here to talk about authentication and multi-factor authentication fatigue. Sinan, welcome back to Paul Security Weekly.
Glad to be back. Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. How's it going?
Good. All is well.
That's good. I think the topic is very timely.
Yes.
Because you you hit on it. Well, you started this whole thing, Sinan, talking about the good old days of like running around to users' machines and installing certificates. So I think that's probably a good place to start is back in history, right?
No, that's right. My first job working at a telco was installing client certificates to Outlook to exchange, for them to have like a mutual authenticated communication with an Exchange endpoint, right? Exchange servers. And this was 25 years ago. Guess what? 25 years later, we're kind of doing the same thing. This time, of course, we have TPM and the CP models. We have the FIDO2 keys in order to have these private keys kind of secure, stored in an enclave. But at the core, it's all about identifying a device, right? 25 years later, we're still trying to solve the same problem. Back then, people were like brute forcing passwords. They were guessing passwords to compromise an Exchange-backed inbox. Now, of course, it's much more sophisticated. There's all these man-in-the-middle phishing. There's the MFA fatigue factor, where you basically carpet bomb somebody with continuous MFA requests till they relent, right? We become a lot more complacent since we deal with the authenticator rep 100 times a day. You just want it to go away, right? So
what's interesting,
25 years later, still the same place.
Yeah, like back, so 20, it wasn't quite 25 for me. I was at university. But Larry, you'll appreciate this. For EAP-TLS, I was putting certificates on client machines manually, as Sinan was describing. Yes.
25 years ago, we were guessing passwords on Unix systems.
Right.
And we were using Loftcrack on Windows. Just and Exchange was like something that nobody used. But that was my 25 years ago.
Because it was all SendMail, right?
That's right.
It was, yeah. But same, it all comes back.
Everything else I agree with.
Comes back around again, though.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah, I mean, at the enterprise, you had a lot of Exchange, right? Because people like to use their Outlook clients with Windows XP experiences, so you had to tie it to Exchange. Microsoft didn't give you any better hooks. But you're right. I mean, depending on if you're in a university, if you're in a public sector, federal, local, state, you will have SendMail, right? That was the main MTA back then. But I did my share of Exchange security. It was a nightmare back then, right? And the only way to deal with this was to make sure that there is a additional layer behind username and password, and that was the client certificate. It was stored on a disk. There wasn't any TPM backing back then, but it still give you a kind of a foolproof method to preventing, all these men in the middle or password guessing or brute forcing attacks.
No, I mean, the TPM isn't like without its flaws, although there are not a whole lot of flaws. It is much better, like you said, than storing it on the disk. But having the TPM is a significant advantage. Although, like, I feel like I've read some papers about bypassing it over the years. Tyler, did you come across some of that research too?
A little bit. A lot of it is based around hardware attacks and some academia stuff, but yeah, it's non-trivial as of right now, at least in well-deployed situations.
Yeah. Well, I think physical access certainly is one mechanism. So that gives us a much better place, right, to store these certificates. So how does it work today, Sinan, and for what purpose, to protect what level of access?
I mean, it got a lot more streamlined. You have asset managers like MDM, RMM, typical examples being Jamf, Intune. You can also access keychain through software mechanism, through inter-process communication. Your application can basically back a certificate securely into the keychain. And if the keychain is backed by an CP model on a MacBook and a TPM on a Windows PC, so it got streamlined, right? So the innovation, I would say, 25 years later, you don't have to put it on a disk or a USB drive and walk up to everybody's PC, desktop or laptop and install it manually. You can actually manage the entire life cycle of these device certificates and securely using a well-defined API, store it into the keychain, into the TPM, hardware-backed keychain, where it makes it a lot more easy to manage. Like you onboard the user, somebody joins the company, you bootstrap the whole process, create a device identifier, the device certificate, tied to the user's identity, stored on the TPM. Next time they try to access SaaS application, an on-prem application, that is a required factor besides the username, password, and MFA, right? That really brings it down to a much more secure posture, which is what the FIDO2 keys, YubiKeys, everybody below with YubiKey does. But I honestly don't see the necessity going forward to have an extra key fob that you have to plug in if the TPM becomes, what it is.
If it's on the machine, though, is that validating more of the machine identity more than the user identity, which is why we have to couple it with the other parts to identify the user is using this machine?
You're right, but there are ways using the keychain mechanism where you can tie that particular private key to the user. So if you log in as a different user, you will need to kind of bootstrap again and onboard the device once again and create a new device certificate. You see what I mean? For a multi-user use of a device, you have to kind of tie the key through the keychain mechanism to the user.
Yeah, there was an article that we're going to cover in the next segment too that was talking like these minute details between the difference between an account, a user, and a computer, right? Or three are essentially three different things. I mean, somewhat it's kind of we do interchange some of those terms.
Those nuances are very important when you start to talk about things like Azure AD and Active Directory and what mechanism is being translated between those. Because if you have something like AD Connect or your Active Directory sync to Azure AD, that Kerberos translation to a SAML and like what is actually doing the translation, what key is getting up there, what tokens and JWTs are activated, all those nuances actually matter, and the way in which you set up your certificate services is the second part to this that no one's speaking about. The TPM is a great place for certificates to live, but that also requires that customers get that certificate process and design done right from the beginning. So that is something to take into consideration as you're deploying these. This is what we need to get to. We just need to do this in the right way, and I think that's where everyone's kind of getting hung up, is how to do this securely.
Spot on. I think the vendors, the ISVs, so that's pretty much what they can help with. Give the customers a mechanism to enable them to distribute these keys, but also manage the entire life cycle, right? You should be able to revoke them. Onboard a user, there's attrition, the user leaves the company, like revoke the certificate. All those should be single clicks, right? Or they should be kind of integrated in Azure AD, that everything can automatically work. So I think that's where the value can be pronounced if you can manage the entire life cycle of that certificate.
So, but sorry, go ahead, Todd.
I was going to say, is there one of the other mechanisms that I feel like I would love to have everything on the TPM, and we should have been using the TPM for the last decade, honestly, in a much better way. One of the things that I get consistent pushback on is some of the secondary factors for things like the YubiKey, where you're able to do a touch press or a pin or a secondary non-attribution destructive key. Like, are there some of those things being planned and able to be utilized with the TPM that you've seen?
I'm talking to a MacBook right now, right? And I do use my touch to basically get access to the ACP through the keychain. So depending on the platform, it's usually baked in. There's some sort of a biometric factor to unlock the TPM. So I don't know what the YubiKeys and the likes are adding to that equation if the device is baked in with some sort of a fingerprint reader or a Face ID or whatever.
And most business laptops now have that ability to have a biometric and a TPM 2.0. Honestly, I would question the purchasing and acquisition of anything with not a TPM and a biometric for things like Windows Hello and the passwordless system and ecosystem that even Windows has brought in. I mean, Mac has the same thing with their touch bar and touch stuff. So from a business standpoint, the hardware is not the limitation. It is simply the implementation, the operating system software, even the online vendors with Apple and Google's FIDO2 Alliance acceptance and what they've moved to. I mean, they've dubbed their own names for them now, but that's all integrated now. So there's really nothing keeping us other than the integrators.
I totally agree.
Even my non-enterprise framework laptop has a fingerprint reader built into it. Yeah.
And a TPM.
And I think security vendors should look into, forget about security and enablement. A lot of these security features and functionality and hardware components baked into the platforms, right? You just basically help people enable with ease of use, the UI, UX improvements, that kind of stuff. Forget about, you just mentioned something like AI, ML, IDS, next gen, detecting 0 days. I'm like, forget about all that. Just help people enable existing assets, right? I think that's what we should be in the business of.
But that would eliminate a lot of our shelfware too, right? Like these applications and some of the vulnerabilities that we see with single sign-on and the security implications of password spraying and all these API endpoints or SAML or SaaS applications exposed to the internet, a lot of that is solved by doing the simple thing that you just said. Let's implement something that has some better authentication mechanisms and has a user at the other end of that that's doing secure authentication. Like, that's a pretty simple mitigation that covers a good portion of the threat.
Attack surface, yeah. 100%. Agreed.
Oh, so now what about all this rolling back and fallback mechanisms? Because a lot of times we say, oh, I have MFA, and I've configured MFA securely. But when you unravel it, you can go all the way back to like a text message or an email sometimes. And that this is, I don't know if it's defeating the purpose of MFA, but not all MFA is built the same. Sinan, so how does I mean, why should or shouldn't we do that, right? I'll ask kind of tee you up for that. But.
That's a very good point. You find immediately the flaw in this whole, whether FIDO2 keys or baking like a device certificate into the TPM. If you have a mechanism to downgrade, and I want to ring Bob Lord's ears about this. There was like a ongoing Twitter discussion about this, and he said, if you have a mechanism to downgrade MFA, let's say, well, you're in a man-in-the-middle phishing proxy, right? The evil Nginx project, and there's variations of that. Mm-hmm. If that project spits out a message saying that, look, it's a JavaScript pop-up, an alert, right? We cannot read your key. Like your YubiKey is, whatever, is not functioning. And then downgrades by basically proxying API requests, let's say to G Suite or to Office 365 or whatever, and then asks for a different factor, right? If your policy enables for the FIDO2 key to be downgraded to SMS or TOTP, something like that, then it's completely pointless. The man-in-the-middle proxy that does the phishing will automatically downgrade it and will say, well, the key's unreadable, it's not working, malfunctioning, whatever, provide me this other factor. So you have to remove all those to actually make it work. You found a good flaw there. That makes a ton of sense, yeah.
So, but the better fallback mechanisms are the series of codes. I mean, kind of unfortunately, right? Because
backup codes, yeah.
You still have to protect them out. You have to protect the backup codes somehow.
Put them with your socks in a drawer somewhere. Yeah,
right. Print them out and put them in your sock drawer.
Safe deposit box, a very, very,
sure.
The TPM you've got for surgically inserted, right next to your heart, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So is the password still a factor in a lot of this? Like, do I have to have the certificate and put in my password, right?
You can remove the password if you also have a means to perhaps do some assessment on the device, right? The device certificate, the client certificate, quote unquote, identifies that it's a corporate asset, but it doesn't mean that it has a good posture, it's a good standing, right? Mm-hmm. You need to bring some contextual telemetry and information where the device is at, what kind of a network it's connected, what's the patch level, is there some sort of hotfix that needed to be deployed, and that all of these things kind of checking out, evaluating the truth, and then you're like, okay, I don't need to ask you for a password. You have the device certificate, the device posture checks out, go ahead and just get access.
Yeah, I mean, Google does some of this pretty well, even your Google accounts. If you move around or change laptops, a lot of that, your behavior, it'll go, yeah, I need your password, which I think is good.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So Can you get a little bit more granular than that? I'm not as familiar with what your guys' product does, but from that standpoint, can you do things like validate what hash or process is initiating the connection, or the time in which it's doing? Some of the more granular, nuanced things of how authentication bypasses happen. I know there's a little bit of granularity in some of those zero trust, but you guys are leveraging a much different approach using certs and the TPM, which is fantastic, because it takes some of the user issues out of this and the agent side of this out. So I'm curious what level of granularity you can actually get down to.
Depends on the deployment mechanism, right? A lot of applications, depending on the endpoint platform, might deploy it as a user mode application, right? They might running as a user context. Like if you're on a mobile device, a tablet or something like that, it only has very limited, because it runs in a sandbox. You can't really have very granular telemetry. You can only have whatever you can grab from within the sandbox. If you look at, a lot of these implementations, they look at disk encryption, firewall, AV, basic things, right? They don't have a lot of fidelity. But what's happening in the industry is that instead of asking the device, because let's be honest, if you are in the application, the user context, you can fake all that stuff. You can say all the telemetry looks great, everything is patched, everything is turned on, because if you compromise the application, you can fake all that stuff, right? But if you do the telemetry checks through integrations to other assets like MDM, RMM, EDR, SIM, right? If you pull it from other backend systems, then the fidelity is a lot better, and then you can make a better judgment whether that device posture is good or not. Does that make sense, Tyler?
I'm just wondering, why more people don't do this, right? Like, because I think the pitch to the end users is you don't have to mess with passwords. Like, we're not going to ask you for your password, hardly ever, right? If ever. We're not going to ask you to change your password. You're not going to be worried about password complexity. Like all those things that users hate about the password. Like a new user comes on, we're going to provision your laptop. It's going to have a certificate in it. It's going to analyze the environment and behavior of your laptop. And I mean, maybe they have another second factor that's the hello camera, the camera on there. It's just a facial recognition. So they don't even have to push anything. It just takes a picture of your face, uses the TPM with the certificate on it, and you're logged in. Like, what's better than that? I mean, this is like security and usability.
You're missing the point. You're missing the point. No offense meant. You're missing the point. The point is not that it's cool and shiny and gadgety and cool, because it is. And the users love when they go, hi, my voice is my password, and they're in. That's cool. But the people that sign the checks to buy these things, to install these things, to implement these things, to iron out all the problems with these things, to train the end users on how to use these things, train the support staff on how to support these things, to write the documents and process and procedures for how to support them. There's a lot more to it than just it's shiny.
I thought it was like it's just wizardry. I thought in the background.
It's automagic.
We've gotten to that point where we're at the precipice of that adoption, right? Like first it's education, we have to get it out there. FIDO's been a thing forever. So this is not a hardware.
And how many people are using FIDO systems?
Exactly. Why is that though? And that is simply because we have not done a great job of educating the ease of use and implementation of this through our chains and implementers, right? Like,
and we haven't made the user interface great. I'm sorry, Tyler. Keep going. I apologize.
No, I mean you're spot on. That whole adoption process relies on us as the technologists to get that message out there in a better manner. That's not a bunch of technoblab. That shows the ease of use. We've not articulated that business return on investment for not getting breached, not having users forget password, the strain on help desk, all of the features that we should be articulating to the business units that are making and writing the checks has not been done. We've just simply said, hey, this is fancy new technology, use it. That's not going to get this adopted.
Dude, that is so well said. And so we haven't educated the people, the users, and then we haven't educated the executives on the savings and the time savings and the cost savings and the P&L budget savings that are there. We haven't made the CISOs productivity improvements. Look at what Google did. Remember when they handed out, 250,000 physical access tokens and got zero phishing attempts or zero successful phishing attempts during 2.5 years or something like that? I forget. Forgive me if I screwed up the numbers. But the point is that there are massive productivity gains to be done by doing this. There's massive amounts of like goodness that comes out of it. But the problem is the people that sign the checks are busy with, oh my God, ransomware. Okay,
I bet
right
Uber
now,
would
right
like to
here.
sign a check right now. I bet Uber would sign a check for this right now.
Very possibly. But that's the thing. The compelling event, I'm sorry, I know I'm monopolizing. Bear with me for 1 second. The compelling event for somebody to upgrade the security with the annoyance and trouble, because no offense, it's annoyance and trouble. I mentioned some of it. There's the buying, the implementing, the support, the education, all the different pieces of this. For somebody to go, okay, let's do all this stuff, there has to be a compelling event that effectively the only thing that happens is that will be that compelling event is a breach. So it's a problem. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. If I may interject a few thoughts. Because I haven't been here in like 9 months.
So he's got lots of thoughts to interject.
Everyone buckle up, get ready, get comfy. Everyone get comfy now.
Get comfy.
PCI, AI, ML.
He's backed up a lot.
Well, it's somewhat related to PCI, but you said it first.
I knew it.
But no, it goes back to the beginnings of information security. I was having a discussion / argument over the weekend with some folks because a friend of mine was of the belief that MFA and 2FA were two different things. And they went ahead to try to describe it. And I'm like, no, they're the same thing. But then I started thinking about it. And it's what we're talking about here. The paradigm that we were taught 35, 40, 50 years ago was there's 3 different factors that are available for authentication. And that is something you have, something you know, or something you are. And I was thinking about, I don't know how many years ago we had a discussion online. It might have been Sinan. I don't know how long he's been coming on, where they were introducing like a 4th idea, which sounds a little bit like what Sinan's talking about, all the physical characteristics and telemetry and things like that, which I kept going around in my brain. It's like, yeah, that's still kind of something you have. But then I was thinking, but wait a minute, most people these days use password managers. They don't know the secret anymore. They don't know the secret password anymore. They are looking it up, and it's something you have.
It's more something you have.
It's more something you have, and I'm like, wait a minute.
That's a great point.
I should be feeling a lot more companies, because they're not doing 2-factor or MFA, as it's now more commonly referred to, because they're really doing two of the same form. What I'm hearing us talking about is get rid of the passwords, which is a secret that's something you know, and replace it with something you are or something you have. But I think the danger is variations of something you have. That can be they can be really extremely different, but by definition, there's still 2 different things that you have.
Something you have, something the attacker has.
Well, there's that.
But guys, I want to say something is getting replaced with the context you're in. So we still have that, right? We're replacing it with something. We're not just removing it. So that's the contextual information: where you are, how many concurrent connections you have. Did you just check in with the badge reader at the office, but you're making a remote VPN connection? That doesn't make sense. So that's the context part, right? That's getting replaced with something you know.
Conditions. Contextual conditions.
Yeah,
so instead
I use them interchangeably, context and condition. I agree.
Yeah, we're on the same page. That's actually fascinating. That's Tyler, what do you think?
And maybe it was Sinan. I don't know how many years ago it was, but I was struggling to remember what was that 4th thing that they were trying to talk about.
I think it was context.
I'm willing to entertain context. You could argue that it falls somewhere in the big 3 bucket of something you have, something you know, something you are.
Something you are.
But nobody. Well, I still memorize my password, but I'm probably the only one left in the world that does that uses a good long password, and I'm okay with the passwords going away if you're using. What got me thinking about this, like it was before COVID, I was checking in at TSA at the airport and looking at the, what's it called, clear line.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay, so they're really just substituting something you have with something you are. Is it really more secure if you're just substituting one of the 3 factors for another of the factors? Nope. I think the answer is no.
That's capitalism. No, that is not correct.
It is capitalism.
But Sinan, I think Sinan, right? The factors are kind of, all that's out the window now. Like technology has changed.
Well, that's kind of the
paradigm,
conclusion
right?
that I was getting to.
Would you agree, Sinan? This is what?
Yeah, I agree.
It's kind of gone. And then I started thinking about, but what about authorization? How many people even understand what the difference between authentication and authorization is? And so, question to you, Sinan, does any of this apply to authorization, or is that a whole different? That's.
I think that's a softball. I think that's a kind of a softball question. It's not if I understand what they're doing correctly.
No, that's super tricky. I don't think a whole lot of people do not understand the distinction. You're spot on, and I think we're still trying to solve the authentication problem. I don't want to do ambulance chasing, so I'm not going to name the company, but there was a recent social engineering. Somebody volunteered their credentials and then on top of it, approved the 2nd factor for the attacker to breach, right? So we're still trying to solve the authentication problem. It's still the landing, the beachhead for attackers, right? Authorization, you're right. Once you compromise the account, you should have only explicit access to things that a particular user needs. They shouldn't be able to laterally move. They shouldn't be able to see the entire network. They shouldn't be able to sweep scan. You're right. We need to bake in authorization, but we still don't have the fundamentals right. So I think, to earlier points, the budget owner needs to invest into authentication. Think of it as enablement. Let's pitch them that it's an enablement story. It's a productivity story. It's not about risk mitigation. Maybe they like that better. I hope they like that enablement story better, productivity story better. Once we solve for that, I think OTC has to come after. Auth10 is a requirement to solo C.
Well, Sinan, I have a question along those lines. With
Hold on, Paul,
multi-factor.
just real quick.
Okay,
Let's
Jeff,
ask
you
that
go.
quick. Well, I just want to clarify because I end up doing the thing that I don't like to do. I threw out terms and said nobody knows what they mean, and then we didn't.
And we didn't
define them.
explain.
So,
That's a good
as simply as I could put, which camera am I on anyway? I can't find it.
One of them.
That
one
one.
of them. That one.
The little one down there.
Oh, it's down there. Authentication is who are you? Are you allowed to be here? Authorization is, okay, you're allowed to be here. What are you allowed to have access to? What can you do? That's the simplest way to put it. So what you were just saying, Sinan, you shouldn't be able to this, that, and the other. Well, it depends on which account you've compromised. Not everybody should have domain admin rights and use that as their daily account. Not everybody should have elevated privileges for this, that, and the other.
Jeff, can I make one point?
No, you'll probably make two.
What's the third A? Authentication, authorization, and
Canadians.
accountability, auditability.
Auditing, yeah, makes sense.
That
Yeah,
came.
how
That
old
came
is
much.
Trump?
That came much later.
How old is AAA?
I don't know.
How long
has
have
it
we
been
this exact
automobiles?
topic?
I want
100
to
years.
say 80s, 90s. It was one of the.
Try the 50s.
Yeah. Okay.
Are we talking about the car AAA or
No.
something else? Okay.
No. We're talking about authentication and authorization. I mean, how and eventually the concept of auditing or accountability. How old is that concept?
From the 1950s.
Radius, I think.
Well, I know.
Jeff would know better.
I used to work authentication and authorization, 30, 40 years ago when I was working for the government, and I got the idea that it had been around for a while at that point. At least since the 70s, because in the 70s, and 60s, I guess. Well, going back to the 50s, Vietnam War. A lot of the Viet Cong were educated in American schools and French schools, and they spoke English with really good English accents, and they had a habit of calling in airstrikes on U.S. troops, and so they had to come up with authentication procedures, which is something that I worked in an office that was responsible for, to try to validate, are you really you? And authorization was sort of a spin-off of that. I mean, that came. We did more authentication. Authorization came later with, getting on computers and networks. But the idea of authentication, at least in a military DoD sense, it goes back, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years.
But I want to put that in the context of today, Sinan. If we have these mechanisms to store a certificate securely on the machine, to understand the context of the machine, to understand maybe some other behaviors, have some other factor of biometrics, we can also use that for authorization and say, well, you get past the first level, you got access, but now you want access to this other thing, and that's where we store all of the sensitive user data. You need to give me some more authentication in order to authorize you for that. In all of those chained together. Is that part of what your solution does as well? Because I know that stuff exists. I don't know how well used it is.
Yeah, I mean, most of these solutions in that category basically integrate with the directory, with the user directory, right? So you need that for authentication. Or if you're an SSO provider, if you're an identity provider, another interchangeable term, you sync with the user directory. That means you understand the hierarchy of the organization. The finance department, HR department, engineering department, which users are in it, which are privileged users, which shouldn't be privileged users. So you kind of try mapping authentication into that, and guess what? Once you have that information, you can make more educated Auth-C decisions, right? Oh, you're in the DevOps group. Why the hell are you trying to access an HR database that stores compensation information, right? Then you can build authorization. Once you get the authentication correct and have all the correct hooks, you can build these explicit policies around who can access what, granted their role in the organization.
Yeah, and I like that better than, because I've seen some organizations where you join and then you don't have access to anything, and everything you need access to, you have to request, and maybe there's some kind of manual or human process that vets that. That's the extreme side of that. On the convenience side, that's very inconvenient. But you don't want to go the other way and go extremely convenient, where everyone has access to everything, because that's really bad too. This is a really nice medium where you can still control access to services and or data, but allow the authorization to be somewhat organic based on the person's role and the other factors associated with how they're authenticating to the system. I think that's great.
Spot on. That's great. And usually it becomes very relaxed. Everything is like before. And then you start auditing, like the third A. I really like that point. Yeah. And then you start, okay, at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, okay, these are the excess requests that make sense. They're coming from HR employees to HR applications. Great. We screw that down, and then that's a policy now. All the outliers, right? Those are the interesting ones that you have to double click and find out what the hell is going on here and maybe customize your policy. But once that's baked in, you basically build an OTC system. One thing I want to add, it's a very interesting point on audit. I think it was Jeff, right? That is a brilliant point, because actually if we were talking about TPM, backing hardware backing for, important things, right? If we can have an audit log that's also backed to an immutable hardware, right? We will put companies like NSO, the surveillance vendors, out of a business, right? Can you imagine that all the links that you clicked on your iPhone is stored in a hardware component that's read-only? Guess what? You do
the blockchain?
I don't. Yeah, you killed me there. You say the dirty word, I'm out.
Tyler, didn't you see my graphic? It's very easy. If you're using blockchain for cryptocurrency, yes. Is it not cryptocurrency? Then no.
Yes, thank you.
But only if you put AI ML on the blockchain.
That's right. Next generation AI ML.
Yeah, I've been begging Apple to bake it. Well, I'm pointing a device with it, just the background screws it, but just build an audit log that stores all these things, read only, it cannot be tampered, no matter what access you got on the device, right? It cannot be tampered. You can only write and append, right? Then you do connect it to iTunes, you see what the hell happened, regardless of what compromised you. If we get that done, we're done. We solve that problem.
That allows a lot of interesting ideas from a SIM and log visibility standpoint. I mean, as an attacker, one of the few things we do is, we shut down whatever software EDR has a hook into Ring 0 with us, or maybe they're only in user land, so it's even easier. That immutable log that then
Ring 0. Now who's sounding old?
No, wait. But Tyler is an amazing point. Remember UTMP, WTMP, under var/log, right? They're all soft files on disk. You go to the last couple entries, delete, you're done. You never accessed anything, right? That's the state of affairs. The syslog daemon, that's the stupid state of affairs. If you can bake it into hardware, well, good luck removing your trail.
Yeah,
that means you'd have to be in the hardware, which is possible, is a lot more difficult.
It just ups.
That's where your line of business comes.
That's
up.
Because when we talked about Ring, so Ring 0 is still Intel.
Not 0, -1.
-1 is the right. Is -1 SMM or the hypervisor? SMM. Right. We can go all the way down to Ring.
I was talking about calling the operator, which was 0 on the top.
I was gonna say, because processor rings are still and privilege rings are still a thing. Now we've morphed them, and I was corrected. It's kind of a tangent, but I was corrected at work to go when we get into the -1, 2, -3 ring, those aren't official Intel architecture rings. These are ones that we've come up with as researchers, but to describe the level of access that one could have into the system. So I wanted to talk about multi-factor authentication fatigue, MFA fatigue. This seems like a solvable, when I thought about it, this seems like a solvable problem, because shouldn't you be able to rate limit this? So multi-factor authentication fatigue, right, is the attacker has my username and password and is constantly requesting the multi-factor authorization. So that goes to my phone or device, let's say, in some capacity, and I have to click accept or deny. And they just keep doing that until basically I get so annoyed that I'm like, if I click push accept, this is going to go away. And I'm in a meeting or I'm busy, I'm doing something, and I want to push accept.
And you can literally hear it.
Yeah, the whole time, buzzing.
Right.
And so I do that. But if I were to, on the back-end system, rate limit that in some way, or for some other authentication, or just reject that login if it crosses some rate limiting threshold. I would imagine,
or send no more than 3 messages in a 24-hour
in a
period.
24-hour period, right? A form of rate limit, right? That's,
Yep.
A form of rate limiting, probably different than what I had in my mind, Larry. But yeah, so Sinan, like, why can't we? Can we do that? Is that possible?
I think they do rate limits. If it's like really within, I don't know, a couple seconds, you kind of push, 10, 20, 30, 100, whatever it is. They do have those mechanisms. Pretty much any API has it. Forget about just the MFA one, right?
Yeah.
Any API endpoint has rate limiting. But I think the problem is not just carpet bombing, they're also timing very well, right? 6:30, 7 a.m., 8 a.m., depending on the executive type, you can time it, right? By the way, you cannot say I'm only grant you 3 times a day because, like, for example, Salesforce, if you have put a timeout for every 2 hours, that's my case, for example, I need to do that thing every 2 hours, and bunch of browser tabs are open, let's say with a SaaS application like Salesforce, they kind of refresh and then generate one. And I'm looking at the phone. There's no indication what generated it, right? I know it's a Salesforce app, but
I gotcha, yep.
Is it a browser tab or which tab? You have no idea, right? So as long as you time it, you sneak one in throughout the workday or early in the morning, whatever the cadence of that person is, right? You'll just get it approved.
On top of that,
spread it out. Spread it out.
Some very good social engineering from an attacker's side. The social engineering side of, hey, you just signed into my false authentication page that I phished you with. Now you get an MFA all of a sudden, and an email that followed that said, hey, you're going to get an MFA. We don't recognize this device you're signing in on. Please re-authenticate with your MFA. That pops up that actually authenticates for the attacker, not you, because they pass the proxy for the credentials. Like, those timing things become an issue. So you really do have to consider your risk threat profile, and do you actually need push? This is where TPM, I believe, comes into play, and even the YubiKey, where you have to have something you are. I feel like if you have SMS or you have this bombing happening and you've got these push, is that really something you have? At that point, that's something that's being presented to you. That's not really something you have in your hand. That is something you're authenticating with, but that's not necessarily an MFA device. So something you have, like a YubiKey where you plug it in, you push the button, that's one thing. Something where you're getting a push notification, I feel like that's abusable. That's something that can be combated, same with SMS, if you use one-time tokens or you use one-time password.
I was going to say, so your like Google Authenticator app is a much better mechanism in this regard.
But also removing those fallbacks, because I will know what your fallbacks are by querying the API or querying whatever I'm abusing from the MFA standpoint. Know what those fallbacks are, and if there are no fallbacks, then that becomes a much harder target, and you have to go about your attack differently. Making this harder for an attacker, that's the whole goal. There's always creative ways to get around this and to social engineer it. It is how much effort I want to put in and how much cost that adds to the attacker for that time to detection, time to remediation, if it gets through.
I like having fallbacks, but what I'm hearing is, where I'm trying to get to with all my accounts, is my fallback factors should be a physical YubiKey or an authenticator app, basically.
Correct.
And maybe a backup code as a total fallback.
Okay, I want to understand what you mean by an authenticator app. Are you talking about TOTP, just the numbers?
Yeah, like Google Authenticator app gives me, so I sync it with my account, and then it presents me with numbers, kind of like an RSA token, right?
It's a software
RSA token.
Right, but that is baked into the man-in-the-middle proxy, right? So they have that screen ready for you. So you go to G Suite, let's say they're man-in-the-middle proxying the whole authentication scheme. You put your username and password, then the TOTP shows up. They're there too. They really at the end of the day, all they steal is the token, JWT, right? And then they continue with that session.
JWT.
So TOTP is not a good idea.
Because they can still steal that. They can still steal that session from the authenticator app.
Correct.
They
proxy that directly through. The Nginx 2 is built in with all.
Which is why something you have isn't a good idea.
Something you have,
they're the same form.
The TPM, right? Like, you have to have that YubiKey that only authorizes your computer, because that's a hardware token, right? Whether it's a YubiKey, whether it's a TPM, that is authorizing that particular device, that pass-through. Now, there is some research around the pass-through for some of these hardware tokens that just came out, but there's a lot of prerequisites that are required in order to do that. So it's not as simple. Again, it is making the attacker's job harder, and you just have to iterate on this. But we have not solved the full authentication unless we get down to the level of where TPM certificates and the hardware are all trusted as part of this chain of trust.
Spot on. That's right.
Interesting.
So
we got to solve for the fallbacks first.
Okay, so what is a valid solution that's going to work with an end user. Let's be clear on this. That's our audience, and is going to be valid enough that an executive is going to sign off on it and pay for it.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the passwordless are exactly that, right? There is a bootstrap process. You are handed over your brand new shiny laptop, you sign in, there's an onboarding, mechanism that basically authenticates you through the SSO, and at the first time it's tofu. So there's some potential weakness there, right? But trust on first use, basically, that's the concept. At that trust on first use, you create a hardware key, you store it in a TPM. From now on, that account is tied to that key. If you try to log in from your home computer, from your wife's laptop, not going to work because you have to present the key.
But is that just for like a Microsoft or Apple or Google? Like, what about Twitter, Facebook, my bank, like all these different accounts?
And what about Zero Trust, where you have to raise the level of authentication?
Web Authn,
sure,
right?
If they support that, you have the answer. You have the answer right there. If they support SAML, if they support OpenID Connect, you can do exactly that thing. Same thing. You'll just be in what we call an SSO proxy. Instead of proxy network traffic, you're proxying authentication. You put the IDP link, the URL for the SAML endpoint as the solution itself, as a passwordless solution. You hit that first in order to authenticate, and the passwordless solution checks the device, checks the key, checks the device posture and context, etc., and then might decide still to pass you to Azure AD or Okta to do username and password authentication. Might choose that option, right? Because it doesn't see enough or there's an anomaly. But if it doesn't see everything checks out, it basically says, okay, go ahead, access whatever you want. So as long as you have SAML and OpenID Connect baked into applications, a lot of them do, you're good to go. You can scale it to any solution.
And how about sorry, go ahead, Tyler.
No, I was going to say trust validation of the machine, the authorization for that machine, the timing, and then the user account cert that's allowed with this SAML, FIDO, like however you're going to do it. If you can validate what you're on and who you are is able to access that particular resource at that given time, given the constraints, and all of those things are immutable, like based on hardware and certificates that has a valid certificate chain and root of trust, that's a pretty good solution. That's about the only way to do that, unless otherwise there's a social engineering path through that. And having that machine piece and the validation of that in coordination with the user piece, that's the only way. And Larry's seen this with the wireless. We've abused misconfigurations in wireless configs because they don't validate one of those pieces to the extent that they
every goddamn wireless test we've been on.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. There is one wireless test that I've been on that wasn't possible.
And you've been on a lot of wireless tests, I feel like.
And as I was joking in Discord, like I've started to refer things to things in decades. And in the last decade and a half, there's only been one test that I've been on that they did it right.
And that's because they cut the wireless off.
No, that's because they implemented it right. Yeah.
So let me ask one more question, Sinan. So now we've got the question of, you've got a way to give you a base authentication that you can do proper zero trust on to a certain extent. Now I've got, for admin permissions, I need to uptick my authentication. How do we uptick from there?
Yeah, step up, right? Step up authentication.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's kind of baked in a lot of these zero trust and passwordless solutions, right? Depending on, it's rudimentary, it's tags. You tag an application to be more critical, quote unquote, a crown jewel, right? And then you can add an additional factor, like, okay, even if I attest that the device is the authorized device, the sanctioned device, it has this device certificate. I just extracted it through the TPM, through the mechanism. The context, telemetry, patch level, everything checks out. But this is such a critical resource that I'm also going to do yet another factor, whatever that is, right? It could be just a push to auth. It could be asking for TOTP, or the classic username password. That's a step-up mechanism. It's a bit manual right now. The other way is that, like we talked about, context and conditions, right? If those change, even if the device checks out, even if the device is attested to be a trusted device, you still can step up, whether two-factor or username password.
My problem with this, and you're answering well, don't get me wrong. My problem with this is that you're saying we have the most secure method as our base level, as our foundational element, and anything else that we want to do a step up is actually less secure, worse. And so that bugs me, and I'm not sure if I'm right to be bugged or not. I don't know.
Yeah, I
Like,
agree.
you-
I mean, you probably want something scalable, right? You shouldn't be thinking about these things. It should just work. But I think it's an intermediary step that we have to go through. Like, think about, I remember my Gmail app, mid-flight, I was flying to Austria, decided to go through all these authentications because it found that my significant location, whatever it is, right? Whatever the AML magic they do in the backend, decided that it was too anomalous and I have to go through all these additional steps. So that's the state of art right now. Ideally, we wouldn't have to do any of that, right? If we can bake everything into hardware, if we can have, trusted mechanisms. But right now, context plays an important role to do step up, and that's the only trigger right now.
Okay, so use the contextual conditions as part of your step up mechanism. I can see that. That actually makes sense.
And it should be less intrusive as possible, right? Like, it should really be something tangible. Like, but for example, the one example that I really love is that you use your badge code reader because the Zero Trust solution has integration to your Envoy or whatever the badge code reader, this physical security solution that you're using at the office. I have hooks into the control plane, right? I'm collecting telemetry. I know who just entered through the door. Yet you're also doing a remote access, right? What the hell is going on here, right? That is a great context to do step up for the remote user. Or deny them, right?
Yeah,
Depends
but
on the policy.
in your example, Sinan, does the system know that you're traveling and know your location, and therefore it doesn't ask you? Because I don't know. Now it's kind of creepy about how much it knows about me, right?
Right, but actually, a system like this caught up not a security breach, but a cheating incident. Somebody was hiring like a couple contractors in Southeast Asia and just showing at work and goofing off all day, right? And then splitting the salary. So they caught that because the dude is in the office, yet there's like VPN station coming in with the same account from mainland China and Southeast India. So they caught the dude because of this disparity, right?
Right.
So it is a bit creepy, I
that.
understand, but it is actually a very relevant method. Again, it's not super smart, but I think the state of art is moving forward, coming up with interesting conditions that you cannot even explain, right? That's the whole magic of machine learning kicks in at that point, that I do see actually a relevant use case for machine learning.
Yep.
What are the patterns that you typically authenticate yourself? And then if there's a major deviation, then whether we deny you or we do several step-up authentication.
And I think training that model well ahead, it also makes sense. I know Google was doing something similar. We talked about that Google. You talked about the Google going in the airplane and so forth. And for a while there, I was getting near constant, like, hey, the new device is signed into your account, and we can't tell where it is and so forth, and getting those alerts. Because I would go to the end of my driveway, my iPhone would disconnect from my Wi-Fi, and it would connect to the cellular provider, which was providing me an IPv6 address, and it couldn't do geolocation on the IPv6 addresses. It said your device is logging in from the United States, and would put a dot right in the middle of it. And now I had to go jump through hoops to log my device back in because it saw me someplace that wasn't home, even though I was literally standing at the end of my driveway because of that switch of networks and IPv6 and all that mess.
That's a very good one. Yeah, agreed. This is why you have to kind of train over time. Sometimes, hopefully, dial the nodes and adjust the models. You're right. There's all these edge cases that we cannot account for, and we'll have to deal with them as one-offs. Unfortunately, you're right. I mean, every time I switch to IPv6, I think I'm in the state of Oregon for some reason. GeoIP is very, rudimentary information. It's not granular.
It's interesting. I think we all talked about whether we bought into it or not. It's probably a different thing, but we would get rid of the password, right? Like that was always the thing. Like password is terrible. And I don't think it's as binary or 0 and 1 as, we're just going to get rid of the password. I think it's all the things we talked about on this segment, right? That it's more of a more complex, complex might be the wrong term, but multiple things that we implement to validate who people are, what machine they're on, that ultimately replaces the password. I don't think it ever truly goes away. What do you think, Sinan?
No, I agree. It won't. It's just that there should be social engineering comes into play, right? It's easy to extract passwords if you're convincing enough. So it shouldn't be enough. I think passwords will be relevant. They will be with us. There's a lot of legacy applications out there that you cannot do any of these tricks. But I think it should not be you have to do credential theft, you steal the password, somebody volunteer their password. That should not be enough. I think that's kind of the attack surface removal story that we're playing for, right? Like, yes, it's going to be there, it's going to be important, but it shouldn't be enough.
Can we aspire to get rid of passwords at this point? Like, can we just make it a norm for us to have to pull a key out or leverage our device in order to authenticate to something so that the password no longer exists? I mean, ideally, that is a naive, idealist idea, I know, but the password is a
pick one. Naive and idealist are sort of opposite ends.
I agree with you, Tyler. It will be the case, but remember the bootstrap, the trust on first use. The trust on first use for, let's say, that the TPM-backed device certificate needs to be unlocked by something, and unfortunately, that's still username and password. So maybe you need the password once, and then hopefully you get rid of it. You don't ever use it again.
What was I saying to you earlier today, Paul? What are the two fundamental problems we have not yet solved? Passwords and trust.
Oh, and I was going to say why Pornhub doesn't have sound while you're in the bathroom.
Yes. Gotta be careful. It connects that Bluetooth speaker.
Larry, my granddaughter's watching.
Larry.
Ah, come on now. Now I lost my train of thought, Larry.
You're welcome.
Oh, I was going to say, we can talk about trust a lot, I think. It's interesting. We didn't talk about it in the context of this conversation, but I was having a conversation on Twitter, and someone said that, like, Windows doesn't trust you, right, as a user, but Linux trusts that you know what you're doing. And I'm like, no. I'm like, Linux doesn't care what you do. And that's very different from trust, right? Very different. Like, I think about my teenage son. Like, I don't trust him in certain situations. I may not care what happens in certain situations because maybe I have compensating controls. Like, I don't trust you. Like, I think you're going to throw a party, but I have lots of cameras in the house, and I know that if you throw a party, you're probably going to get caught.
Yep. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, but that's not caring and trust are different things. Yeah.
Technically, you don't have compensating controls. You have countermeasures.
Countermeasures. I would agree. Sense. I would agree. When I said that, I'm like, Jeff is going to correct me on this.
And I did. Isn't it good? Why don't you let him back?
I am. So, anything else you want to share about what you're working on at Barracuda? So this is like a product offering from Barracuda. We really didn't like frame that. We kind of talked about it in general, but this is and I know there's lots of solutions on the market that tackle this particular problem, but yours is one that tackles this in a specific way to allow you basically be more smart about how users and machines prove who they are and should they be trusted or not, essentially.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, and again, I want to touch on the enablement part. We're not really becoming, super creative and visionary and throwing scientific terms in there. No, it's basically managing the life cycle of a device certificate. That's the value proposition that I'm offering, right? Yeah. Because it's been traditionally tough. You used to do it manually. How do you revoke it if you put it there manually? So it's essentially giving you a mechanism to basically implement device identity as yet another factor and be able to manage the entire life cycle as you onboard new users, as you onboard new devices, you toss devices away. You toss a device, somebody finds it, they were able to break through, break in, they shouldn't be able to use it, right? That certificate should already be revoked. So that kind of stuff, right? That's the solution at the end of the day. It's enablement more than security is the outcome, but it's an enablement product.
That's awesome. Folks can learn more at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Sinan, as always, it's wonderful having you here on the show today.
How do we know that was really Sinan talking just now?
Well, he has to authenticate. We have to trust.
That's a whole another problem.
Trust but verify. Coming up next, the security news for this week. Stay tuned.